Well, thank you very much for these rich talks and illuminations. Maybe I'll just begin the discussion by picking up on something that you said toward the end about the problem of community. You can't hear. Let me just see if I can. Hello? Maybe I'll go like this. I'll pick up on something that you mentioned toward the end of your lecture about the question of community, and you warned of the dangers of essentializing notions of community. You linked it to kind of a phantasm of immediacy, and so on and so forth. And I wonder if it's possible to put into sort of syntactical relation sort of the notions of community that are implicitly operative in your two papers, where you warn on the one hand against these dangers of an essentialized notion of a potentially regressive community, and the other kind of community that we saw being mobilized in the first paper under very different circumstances. Presumably that is within the logic and the framework of the second paper. What we saw in the first paper is not the type of essentializing or ontologizing framework that you rightly call into question. But nevertheless, what kind of a community or what kind of a concept of community is then operative in the kind of thinking of connection and relatability that we saw in the first paper, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think when we talk about, can you hear me? Do you now hear me? Oh, okay. Yeah, I think when we talk about media of connection or communication media in any sense, it's always important to see that they're not only about connection but also about disconnection, about distance. And that's what you showed in your talk, that all these people are dealing with questions of disconnection, of delay, or of difference in a way. So I think when we talk about community, or about the media of community, or the media that are necessary to form a community, we should always think of these two poles of connection and disconnection. And this is, of course, I think a political question. It's not only a question of technology or a question of theory, but it's a political question of how do we deal with a community that is disconnected and in which not everyone is connected with everyone else.
I guess I would just add to that I don't see it only as a political question because...
I think you may have to speak directly. It's very tricky.
Just that, access to the technology means that people are able to formulate communities in specific kinds of ways. So in the two examples I talked about, there were communities that pre-existed the arrival of the internet and mobile telephony, but the disconnection from those services also means that the kind of formations that are possible are distinct and different. And so I see it as a technical issue as well as a political issue. So I wouldn't be able to, I guess, separate those two so neatly.
Yeah, then that's, I think, very important when you talk about digital networks, that it's almost impossible to separate the question of the social and of the technical nowadays. So I think that was something that was very prominent in German media theory, of course, in the 1980s and 90s. They were only dealing with the technological side and refused to talk about the social, but that's something that we cannot do anymore today.
I think Wendy is next.
Around. First of all, thank you for such a spectacular panel. The papers worked so beautifully together. So I have a question for each one of you. First of all, Lisa, I loved how you were layering so many things together, both the sort of residual medias as well as your call for different typologies and sensings of infrastructure. But your anecdote from Weiwei also got me thinking about what visiting or sensing also renders insensing. And to what extent, given your visitings and your sensings, what do you think is made invisible, or a different understanding of the insensible that can emerge precisely from this work. And then secondly, Florian, to just bring Lisa's last comment about residual infrastructures to yours, of course, what you so beautifully showed was the dreams of electricity were also built against water, right? So if you think of what a current even is, it's defined in terms of water, in terms of these slower infrastructures, which can't be all, that aren't that allegedly giving as electricity. So I wanted you to think a little more about the electrical network in contrast to and in relationship to water networks as precisely central to both that desire and that imagining of both the national and the global community. And then...
Sure. Thanks for the question. Oh, are we taking other questions first? Oh, okay.
Please go ahead.
All right. Thank you for the question. This notion of, you know, the proximity of the researcher to a set of material conditions leading to greater intelligibility, access, coherence is something that I've long tried to question. In my first book, Culture in Orbit, I talk about a whole problematic of distance and proximity in relation to field work. And the idea that sometimes you get to a place and you find that you knew less that you thought you would know, you know, after you arrived there. So I think it can lead to issues of insensibility, you know, the insensible. But I think this is not just related to the researcher going to a location. It also has to do with like the restrictions of IRB, you know, the human subjects protocols that are imposed upon us as researchers and how they circumscribe, they can circumscribe what we do as researchers. And I'm constantly finding that, you know, those bounds are being tested. In this, I purposely didn't show faces of people that I interviewed in Mongolia because of that. You know, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm really getting at your question, but I do agree. I don't accept the idea that you go there and you know everything at all. If anything, you go there and you know way less than you thought you could ever know. And I tried to make that point like earlier in my career, and that keeps getting reiterated. At the same time, I try to emphasize in the longer versions of my work, like positionality of partiality and limits to what we can know, and probably should have flagged that a little bit more here, but yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah, you asked about the electric currents and about the metaphors of water that are very important in the history of physics and also in the history of media, because we all talk about media that flow, or media flows, not only in television, but also, for example, when you were talking about the internet. But I think even for electricity, it's important to see that there is nothing that flows. There is no substance. Electricity are changing, different changes of matter, but there is no substance that is transmitted through a wire. It's just a different state of matter. So with these metaphors, we see that there is this difference between the metaphorical description, which is prone to an immediacy, and what actually happens technically or physically. And I think that we can see this difference still today when you talk about the flows of the internet, while in fact they don't flow, but they burst all the time.
Yes, so my question goes a bit in a different direction. So I was very interested that in both papers there were a lot of reflections on the concept of time and how this is related to the work. And so I mean, if you go back to McLuhan's big prophecy, that there will be a community, and this will be, I mean, defined by the end of time and space. So it's this kind of timeless community. So, and this is the social form, if you want, to think it's that it's unchangeable, it's at an end state, so to say. And so I found it very interesting that both papers, I mean, emphasize this different time regimes, so to say, where work is involved on some level on the human side of the man who holds the cables. So we have there a kind of commodification of time. So we have the labor time, we have the time you have to buy or sell electricity, network access, and so on. So what would happen if we really would take it in the center and start again to think about, is it also kind of infrastructuring of time? So whose time is, sold here, and who is on some level be the master of this time regimes? And then I think it's very interesting because formerly we always thought about the networks in spatial categories, and now it becomes so evident that it's basically a temporal regime, and so that we have to enter in a kind of time stream there. And this brings it back to, who is really the one who, has the power over distributing time. And as we know in remote and peripheric regions, lifetime is also shorter than in the centers. So it seems that there's a kind of political aspect in taking more seriously the commodification of time that is distributed with these networks that pretend not to be about time.
Yeah, I think what is important about the temporalities that arise with electricity is that they are not sensible or not visible for us. They are way beyond the thresholds of our perception. That means that we cannot perceive anything that happens at such short intervals of time. And I think it's exactly this temporality that is used today in all our smart media and ubiquitous media, because they all operate with this temporalities, as Mark Hansen has shown in his work. So I think that this is actually what this history shows us, that when we look at these technical media, we should look at those micro-temporalities that are way beyond what we can perceive, but still, in a way, of course, they relate to us. So I think we have to think about what is our relation to these micro-temporalities.
I think it's a really important question, and something that we all, in media studies, we need better terms of temporality. We need more, we need to be able to understand how long it takes, how many hops and how long those hops take when we move through the internet. The trace route software like Visual Route, which people have been using for 15 years now, still hasn't translated into us talking about, what our connectivity is in terms of temporal structures. And I think because they're among a kind of, economic elite, there tends to be relative homogeneity. As you say, the networks pretend to be atemporal, that they remain somewhat unintelligible to us as critics and historians, and there's a need to just start getting more specific and build temporality into analysis much more regularly. So all I can say is thank you for the question and the challenge.
There are about 3 or 4 more people who'd like to intervene as well. We only have 5 minutes, so perhaps what we'll do is we'll collect these questions and comments and think about them together. Maybe you'll start?
Yeah, I think that that media theory, and especially like the kind of high technology, tends to abstract, and that's great. That's how we understand. But then there is a dimension of a collapse. So there is a voltage capacity, there is ampacity, amperage, and then that's kind of a bandwidth, and it works with electricity, but also with the information kind of volume. So I'm just interested, and also these kind of insights where you can't really just like store, or it's very hard to store the electricity. It goes to battery, or it's just like wasted. So I just wonder how these kind of dimensions relates to what you were talking about, the medians and yeah.
Hi, this is specifically for Lisa. I was struck by how you kind of started with a departure point from queer and feminist and race theory, and I really appreciated how you were focusing on the people in a certain way, specifically in the second example, I would say almost anthropologically. And I think even really what you're getting at is the affect of the community itself, the initial question, which is really kind of these groups of people that are there, and it was about the community that was then realizing something technologically. And I felt like, not that they had to be synonymous, but the first part was kind of missing that. And I just wanted to pose the question, one thing that I kept thinking about, which I imagine the GER was half of the capital, is informality and illegality in terms of a settlement. Are these, how that fits into the urban structure?
Hi, thank you for your talks. What came to mind with both is about maybe the financial infrastructures of which, how the cable, the transatlantic cable was financed, but also to Lisa, to tie into the essentialization of communities, the fundraising video, which reminds one of a crowdfunding video, but I went to the website and it's actually a donation. So my question, I guess, is then, because if we do micro-patronage nowadays, instead of, let's say, public and state supports, and are we part of that community as well?
I had a question, but it's fine. Should I go quickly? Okay. I was just wondering, thanks for the talks. I was wondering whether these fantasies of the instantaneous kind of show up in Lisa's works, because they seem to, right? There's this sense of being connected and this, that you need to be online rather than, you know, trading data in other ways. And the same with the radio, that it's a question of broadcast, and it's not, you know, but not a question maybe of podcasting or something like that. So I'm just wondering, you mentioned that there might be other ways in which they deal with data in the first example. In the second, if there's other examples of how whether they're so obsessed with whether this fantasy still crops up of being connected or being, you know, hearing the radio, or whether they also have podcasts and other things. So, yeah, thanks.
I was looking for a slide related to the question of energy. I think that I'm working on a piece called Energizing Media about the relationship between different energy sources and the kind of content that becomes possible based on what kind of energy source you use. So instead of having typologies of media that are just about genres and narrative structures or national cinemas or, you know, local, we could have like lithium video, you know, which is made with cell phone battery, or thinking about solar power energizing big Hollywood productions in certain areas. I created a kind of a typology around this that I was looking for, and I've worked on it a while ago, so it's not very fresh on the tip of my tongue. But that, like, thinking carefully about the relationship between energy sources and what kinds of content becomes possible and takes form, I think is a great point that you made, or that you're trying to get at. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but it's what I was thinking of in relation to it.
Yeah, I totally agree that when you look at this question of energy, it's always a question of who owns the infrastructures. So that's very close to what Renee asked. When we talk about infrastructures, we always talk about the people or the companies or the states that own these infrastructures. And the collapse might also be a kind of economic collapse when an infrastructure collapses.
All right, thank you very much. Good German punctuality. So I think we're off to a very good start with this first panel. Thanks again to our panelists, and thanks to the audience.